Alright, in this one I'm going to be talking about Genesis chapter 6, which is about the flood. But not only that, but it includes the stuff about the Nephilim, which is pretty interesting. And there's a lot of different viewpoints on it, but I'm just going to share with you what I found. Um, but just to start off on chapter 6, in verse 3, when it says, "The Lord said, My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. This is a warning for the flood, and when everything would come to an end, in which in Isaiah 57:16 and Revelations 22:11, um, it will likewise end for all of humanity. So at the second time, like at the end of the ages, the same general concept is gonna happen. 120 is the time of probation before the flood, and in Matthew 24:39. Matthew comments on people not being prepared for the flood, which of course the flood he's talking about is at the end of time. See, this is when things start getting pretty interesting. In 6:4, when it says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of man went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old men of renown." Alright, there's a lot of different viewpoints regarding Nephilim and just the concept of that verse, okay? But I'm going to really, really break it down, with the whole Nephilim idea, okay? Nephilim, it's derived from the Hebrew root nephal, which means to fall, kill, run, or to cause to fall. And in a lot of translations, it's translated into giants. And of course, that was in the day of the Canaanites, which, Goliath and all the story about that. And Nephilim, it's also translated as to fallen angels. And when it says they were there before and after, that's talking that they were there before the flood and after the flood. Okay? And they're mentioned again in Numbers 13, verse 32 and 33, which I said is talking about the giants in Canaan. And in that story, the spies go out and they see all these giants, and they come back and they say, in our eyes we looked like grasshoppers and we looked the same to them. So, they're just blown away by how big these people were. And those giants in Canaan, they were the descendants of Enoch, or they're known as the Anakim. And in Ezekiel 32:37, it speaks of, quote, the fallen mighty. And see, sons of mighty, which is B'nai Elim, is used in Psalms 29:1 and Psalms 89:6, and it's referring to the angels. And like the reason I think that the Nephilim were, these fallen angels, was because there's a clarification, in my other videos where I talked about, the sons of God and daughters of men. Is that the beings were sons of God rather than men because they had been created, not born. And of course, the idea of being created only refers to Adam, in Luke 3:38, and to the angels who God directly created, which is in Psalms 148, Psalms 104, Colossians 1:16. Like, it's mentioned a bunch of other times. So, how Eve was the mother of all living, okay? So that talks about people who are born of man, like us. And then you have the sons of God who were created, okay? And something else that's pretty interesting. The son, or quote, sons of God appears in only 5 verses from only 2 books in the Old Testament. There's 2 in Genesis and 3 in Job. And in Job, it's mentioned B'nai Elohim. And then Bar Elohim is used in Daniel 3:25. And it's either referring to the angels or the theophany. And in Job, it describes them as angelic beings, and that it either entered directly into God's presence or existed before creation, which goes along with the angels. They had been there at all times. See, in the New Testament, sons of God is always referring to redeemed human beings. And of course, going back to the Nephilim, they're referred to as fallen angels, which we all know are demons, okay, and who mated with human females and or possess human males and then mated with the human females. And if you look at the very first verse of chapter 6, it says, "When men began to increase in number on the earth, and the daughters were born unto them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they choose." Okay, so it mentions man, and then daughters. It says men increased in number on the earth, and then the daughters were born unto them. Okay, and then the sons of God saw. So it's talking about the men and then sons of God. So that shows you that as like man, had children with the females, and then the sons of God were the fallen angels. They kind of interfered, and like but Satan's plan, like Satan was wanting to build his army, okay, because he knows the final battle, and that God's army is going to be, the devil knows how strong God's army is going to be, okay, so he's wanting to create his army. The devil's wanting to create his army and make it as big as possible to have some kind of a competition, which there's really not going to be a competition. And so he's taking every chance he gets, because like in the last video, the devil wants us to pull away from God. He wants us to fall away from God and, turn against him and be in the devil's army. And so going off of the sons of God and daughters of men, they like the offspring that they created, were heroes of old men of renown. And going off of that, think about Greek mythology, okay? You have Zeus, you have Hercules, you have, all these huge people, and they were known as gods. They're the god of this, god of that, and people worship those gods. That's exactly what the devil wanted them to do, okay? And when, like, all of that is talking about the Nephilim. And so the devil created these people of huge sizes, to, I guess, make these almost like a hybrid group of people, so they would be, or to use in his army. And like I said, in those times, those giants, like the Greek gods, were worshipped by those people. And like I said, that's what the devil wanted us to do, to build his army. And so, let's see, and then of course God, he was highly upset, because he says the world was of pure evil, and in humans' eyes, like in those times, humans saw those gods as like these awesome, powerful men, of great size and strength, and kind of going off of that, think about the pyramids, Stonehenge, all these in those big structures, stone structures, and they're saying how in the world, National Geographic, they're saying like how in the world did they move all these stones over here and stack them, and I was watching a video the other day, and this huge structure that was created by stone, the stones were so big that they couldn't even, begin to figure out how much it weighed. It was beyond comprehension, and the stones were put together so close you couldn't even put a razor between them, and a normal human being, they can't do that. I mean, you see strongmen lift cars and everything else, but that's just the front ends, and these people were moving stones and building structures. And so, when all those, on National Geographic, when they're trying to figure out, how did all this happen, how did they move these things? If you think about it, Stonehenge and the pyramids, they're all about the gods, okay? Like, they're all set up, for the gods, like pointing in their direction, to get the sunlight and all this stuff, okay? And so that goes along with exactly what I was talking about. The devil wants us to believe in like these gods and get our focus off the God that we serve. And so, and that's why all those things were created. They weren't normal human beings who created them. And in verse 7, when it says, he was going to destroy man, that's not from natural causes. Like God just wanted to start over, okay? And of course, the flood was an act of God, which is in Ezekiel 33:11. And in verse 8, when it talks about grace isn't solely a New Testament concept. Like he had it before the New Testament, like in Deuteronomy 14:01. And the Lord has grace for all, but not everybody wants to apply it to their life. And of course, Noah had 3 sons, which I talked about in the last video. Let's see. And then verse 13, I believe. Well, yeah, verse 13, cypress wood actually means uncertain, which has no relevance whatsoever. I just thought it was kind of interesting. And God gave specific instructions, which were most likely in that time more detailed than what we have now. And just like in the construction of the wilderness sanctuary in Exodus 25:08. And, if you read the Bible, you know that God is very strict. Like, he says what to do, how to do it, what not to do, what we need to do in order to be saved. And so, reading the Bible, it's easy to kind of say, well, I don't know what he meant there. Well, the Bible wasn't created for an easy reading book. And, it talks about in the Bible how, you're given milk, but then you grow into solid foods, which is talking about, when we're young, we read the Bible, hear all these cool stories. But as we get older and our spiritual maturity increases, we are to just dig into the Bible and learn as much as possible, because the Word is God, so we need to know God as much as possible. And so, all of his instructions, so we know exactly what he wants us to do. There's no guessing, because how strict he is to get into heaven. It's up to us to know exactly what we need to do to get there. And so that's kind of why I'm going into depth about this, because there's so many prophecies in the Bible that have been fulfilled, are being fulfilled, and that still need to be fulfilled. And going towards the end of time, Christ isn't going to return to earth until every prophecy in the Bible is fulfilled, because the second coming is the last and final prophecy. And so reading the Bible, when you can read these prophecies, throughout the whole Bible, everyone's, especially the disciples and all, they're saying, this is what to look for. This is what it's going to be like at the end of time. In Noah, when it was time, like what I was just talking about, how, there's the Nephilim and how it's full of evil and, things along those lines. And when it's, and if you look in the New Testament, when it says, in the days of Noah, this is going to happen. Or just like in the days of Noah, this is what's going to happen. And if you were to only read the New Testament, you wouldn't know what the story's talking about. You wouldn't know what he's quoting and referring to. And so, going in depth like this, you know exactly what he's referring to. When he says, like, just as in the days of Noah, it shall be, whatever, I can't quote it, but he's talking about, when the fallen angels come again, and there's just going to be pure evil, and, all these false prophets, and, Antichrist, and demons, and everything else just like it is now, but it's going to be even more so, before the second coming. And, just like how Noah created the ark, and they were the only pure, bloodline and pure genealogy at that time. That's why they were saved. That's why they were put in the boat. And I think of it as like a second, like kind of like the rapture. God, when everything is so bad, Noah and his family, they never fell away from God. Noah never lost focus on God. And that's why God favored him. God, it says, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of this time, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So like Noah was surrounded by all this evil, but he never lost focus. And so that's how we should be. All these earthly things going on, it's easy to lose focus of God. But we need to make sure we don't lose sight of him. And it's going to be hard. God talks about how it's going to be hard, but in the end, if we keep our focus on God, we're going to be saved. We're going to be raptured from the second coming, and all the destruction that will be happening at the time. So Noah and his family, they're on the boat, and, and then the whole flood happens, and, just the entire earth and everything on earth is wiped out. And so that's kind of how it's going to be. Everything on earth is going to be burned to the ground. It says in the Bible, everything will be burned. But we're not going to be here for it. We're going to be with God. And like going back to 6, when kind kind of talking about when he got all the animals onto the boat. Now, a lot of people think, like, how in the world could you fit 2 of every animal on the boat? Well, you have to be smart about it. First of all, the birds of the air, they fly, so they won't have to worry about the water and the flood. And if they want to find somewhere to land, they land on the ark. 2, creatures of the water, they swim. Of course, the floods is going to make it a field day for them. And so that's the same reason why fossils have been found on top of mountains and seashells and everything else. It's because the flood was up to that level, so there were, sea living creatures at the time. And as far as like animals that were actually in the ark, he got the babies. Like, use common sense. He didn't get the biggest elephants he could find. He got the babies. He was smart about it. And it says 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you and be kept alive. Okay? When it says it will come to you, he's saying, like, Noah didn't have to go out and say, like, grab 2 horses, grab 2 pigs, grab 2 cows, whatever. I think they were guided by angels because God says they will come to you. And, let's see. What verse was it? I can't find it, but I can't find it. But it says, they came to Noah. So Noah didn't have to go get them. I think they were guided by angels. And so, so that clearly explains how he was able to fit them on there. And then when it says the kind of animal, kind of bird, okay, this is kind of when an evolution thing comes in, because you know how we have, for example, finches, the little birds. There's so many different species of finches, okay, but they all come from a finch, okay. And so when it says every kind of bird, he didn't get every kind of finch on Earth. He got, the original finch, and then, you have wild horses and all these different breeds of horses. He got, the one kind of horse. Okay, all these other species that we have, he got the original one. Okay, so that's how, he was able to keep them on there, or get all those animals on the boat. But that's about it for chapter 6. It's a fairly short chapter, but there's a lot to it. So, hope you learned something, and I'll see you on the next video.